All right, so we are on Lamed Aleph from base 31b. So where we're at is like this. We explained that we don't have a dispute in law, but we have a dispute in the reading of the Mishnah. So the Mishnah, I'm just pulling up my phone. So the Mishnah said like this. The Mishnah gave us 1, 2, 3, 4 cases. The first case is 1 against 1. The first 2 cases are 1 against 1. And the second 2 cases are 1 against 2. So let's break it's an easy way to remember. The first is 1 against, first 2 are 1 against 1. The second is 1 against 2. So the first case was 1 witness against 1 witness. Second case was 1 woman testifying against another woman testifying. Those are the first 2 cases of 1 against 1. Witness against witness in the singular, and female against female. 1 saying yes intimacy, 1 saying no intimacy. The second 2 cases where it's 1 against 2 is the same case, just each one in the reverse. 1 saying intimacy, 2 saying no intimacy, or the reverse, 2 saying yes intimacy, 1 saying no intimacy. Those are the 4 cases. We've been discussing, I'm mentioning this because we're going to see it's relevant. We've been discussing the first case, which is 1 against 1. Now, we went along with the principle yesterday that if Torah gives the believability to a single witness, he's treated as 2. And therefore, if 1 comes along and says, I saw intimacy, and Torah gives this person the believability, then we consider it as if 2 witnesses are standing here. So when someone else comes along and says, no, there wasn't, it should be considered 2 against 1. Now, if that's the case, the law should be that the law is called off because we have 2 witnesses, wink, wink, 1 witness, who told us there was intimacy. And once we know there's intimacy, cite the law called off. 1 person coming along and denying that doesn't have the power to overturn the original testimony of that 1 person, which we considered as 2. That was a discussion yesterday. So we had 2 ways of responding to this problem. Yeah, you follow it with me? With me or no?
Yeah, if it says it's the second one,
yeah,
it says there was no intimacy.
Yeah.
One of them, the one who says there wasn't anything,
Yeah.
Could say, I approve. Here's a bill that we were both in.
Okay, so if this,
together.
we're going to assume for now that there's no other evidence but their testimony. There's no other end of evidence.
So you just said yes.
It's just 1 against 1. That's all we have going for us, right? So ostensibly at this point, this is what we established yesterday, that if 1 person says there is intimacy, another person says there's no intimacy, we consider the first witness as if it was 2, and therefore we take his word, and the second guy who undermines that is discarded. Now the Mishnah said 1 against 1, the Sotah law continues going. She goes on and drinks the water, which implies they cancel each other out, which is against the principle we just established. So how do we solve this issue? So we have 2 ways of solving it. One way of solving it is adding a word to the Mishnah, saying, no, lo ishaisa, she doesn't drink, meaning it is called off because we believe the first guy as if he was 2, and the second person coming along canceling it doesn't count, and therefore she doesn't drink. I'm sorry, and therefore she doesn't drink because we established that there was intimacy. That was one way of solving the problem. The other way of solving the problem is that the 2 witnesses, 1 against each other, 1 saying, yes, there was intimacy, and 1 saying there wasn't, both are speaking at once. And therefore we never had the time to cross-examine the single witness who says there is intimacy, and therefore never had the time to establish him as a witness that has believability on the level of 2. Because in order to give that single witness who comes forward to tell us that there's intimacy, the level of believability as if it was 2 is if only we cross-examine. And because in this case it came at once, therefore they cancel each other out, and therefore the Sotah law goes on. Those are the 2 ways of solving the issue.
Question the single who's considered testimony.
After we've already cross-examined the first witness who says there is intimacy,
right,
and given that cross-examination, we give him the believability of 2. The second guy comes forward, if he's a single witness, we say, sorry, it's too late. no reason to cross-examine the guy because he has no believability.
Okay, so the first one was question.
That's right. Unless the second guy comes with a friend, now we have 2 against 2, which cancel each other out, right?
Right.
But if it's only 1, there's no reason to even. Yeah. Okay. So now what we need to do is we need to take this principle, which is in Rabbi's view, right? Who said that our Mishnah, speaking of witnesses that come forward simultaneously, whereas Ullah's view was, we're talking about witnesses that don't come simultaneously, and therefore we give the believability to the first guy, and therefore amend the Mishnah to read, she doesn't drink. We have to substantiate all the other 4 cases in accordance with what they just said. Because there's 4 cases in the Mishnah, 2 of 1 against 1. The first is 1 witness versus another witness, 1 woman versus another woman, both of which get the same law in the Mishnah, either drink in Rabbi's view because they're speaking simultaneously and cancel each other out, or don't drink in Ullah's view because we cross-examine the first guy or the first woman, right? And then who's considered credible. And then we have to substantiate it with the second 2 cases, which is 1 witness comes forward and says, yes, intimacy, 2 says no, in which case the 2 overpower the 1. And therefore the Sotah law continues because 2 say no, or the reverse. 2 guys say yes, 1 says no, the Sotah law is called off because 2 guys said there was intimacy. So now in those cases, are they coming at once? Are they coming one after the other? And how do we substantiate that based on the 2 different versions of the reading of the Mishnah that we established yesterday? This is the exercise the Gemara is going to do today. There's a lot of pieces. Hope it's not too confusing, but we'll see as we come to that.
I don't know how they come simultaneously. If I catch you.
No, they come to the court simultaneously.
Oh, okay.
So the court doesn't have time to establish
How is
anyone
the
as
second
more.
one no?
Well, the second one says, word gets out that so-and-so is claiming that Tuesday at 3 o'clock there was intimacy, and the other guy comes forward and says, whoa, hold on a second. I was there at that time, nothing happened.
So how much time could transpire between the 2?
So, okay, in order for them to be considered simultaneous,
I saw
Right.
somebody, I saw this, okay?
in other words, when does simultaneous stop existing?
Yeah.
It's a very good question, and actually I'm a little bit confused on Rashi's account, because Rashi gives us actually 2 markers. In one sentence, he gives us 2 markers, which seem to contradict each other. I'm sure there's commentary on this Rashi. But Rashi says like this. When the 2 of them come together, and he uses the phrase, Taich Kedei Dibur. Taich Kedei Dibur literally means within the amount of time of speaking. It's a halachic phrasing, which refers to something you do within the span of like 4 seconds of the thing you just did before. So say, for example, this is an example. If you are in the middle of davening Shemona Esrei and you say the wrong variation, if within, quote, Taich Kedei Dibur, within the span of 4 or 5 seconds, you correct yourself, it's considered a good correction because you're speaking Taich Kedei Dibur, you're speaking as if you're still in the middle of speaking. That's how Rashi describes them coming simultaneously, right? Which means, and if Rashi says, therefore the original guy's words is immediately canceled out, which would mean anything beyond 4 or 5 seconds is not considered simultaneous and the first guy gets believability. That's the way you would read from that root. But then Rashi goes on to say, because his testimony has not been substantiated in Bezdin. Now that sounds like the Bezdin goes through an examination and establishes it, which means it takes much longer than within 4 or 5 seconds. So within one line of Rashi, it seems to not be 100% clear. Unless Rashi is saying, once the guy speaks and his words have been let to ring for 5 or 6 seconds, even if Bezdin doesn't cross-examine him, his words are established because he spoke and no one argued. Which is a very,
Strange word.
yeah. Because in other words, had Rashi not added those words because his words haven't been established in Bezdin, it would have been okay. So no one contradicted him within the amount of speaking time, so we have to take what he says at face value. But Rashi adds this line because his words haven't been established in Bezdin, and within 5 seconds of standing there, his words were established in Bezdin. Unless Rashi means something like this. I'm just thinking out loud. Maybe it means something like this. If a person speaks, one witness is speaking, and within 5 seconds, someone else contradicts him. Okay, they cancel each other out. If, however, one guy speaks, his words are let to ring for 5, 6, 7 seconds, and someone else comes and speaks, contradicts him. Because the second person who contradicts him did not do so within that time frame, therefore we as a Beis Din are now required to go ahead and cross-examine and witness number one to see if we can establish or not. If someone contradicts him within the span of 4 or 5 seconds, we're not even obligated to cross-examine the first guy because they cancel each other out. But once the words have been let to linger beyond those 4 or 5 seconds, now it's incumbent upon the Beis Din to actually go cross-examine. And maybe that's what Rashi means by combining the two. Maybe. It's not clear in the words, but maybe. I'm certain there are commentary on this Rashi. Anyway, I kind of avoided it yesterday just by saying the Beis Din has to establish. But since you asked specifically how long it is, I'm telling you what my thoughts are.
To know without understanding the procedural realities
Of a Beis Din.
of a Beis Din.
Right.
Yeah.
So it seems actually that they broke from procedure here. I was thinking about that also because ordinarily the procedure is the witnesses have to stand outside, and then one witness is called in, asked a bunch of questions, cross-examined. He's told to go out, and the next person comes in, and they cross-examine him, and then they look to see if the evidence corroborates.
It sounds like a shouting fest.
Yeah, and this sounds like just people are yelling at each other over each other,
Yeah.
which,
Do it one by one.
yeah, unless the person, knowing so strongly, and I know so-and-so has it in for so-and-so. I know he's about to run to the Beis Din and lie. I'm going to barge in there and say, do not listen to this guy. That's what sounds like is happening. So it doesn't seem like this is the ordinary procedure, which is, the Beis Din sits, says, wait outside, please. You come forward, no one else in the room, cross-examine, send them out to a different room so they don't communicate, call the next guy in, cross-examine him, send them both out, discuss amongst each other, well, what did we hear? What didn't we hear? What kind of questions you want to ask next? That's usually what happens. But here it seems like there's a little bit of a shouting match. So I don't know. Although, interestingly,
The Beis Din is smart enough to do it one by one.
sorry?
Well, but that's the procedure.
Yeah, that's the procedure. But what's interesting though is actually, I just think about this now. I can't remember where I read this. Reading a biography on Nashi. Can't remember where I read this. And it described how Shabbos afternoon is when he would hold court. And it was in the shul, like as at a public fair. Where people would watch the proceedings of what's going on. Where was I reading this? Shabbos afternoon was the best time for women to go make their claims for some reason. Like after the meal, Shabbos afternoon, women would come forward and make their claims or whatever. I can't remember why it was Shabbos. Certain proceedings are not allowed to be done on Shabbos. So maybe Rashi was just answering halakhic questions on the spot. This is all from memory, so I don't know. Don't quote me on any of this, but even though it's being recorded, but still, I'm just kind of thinking out loud. Okay. So let's go back to where we are. So we have one version of the Mishnah in which the two witnesses come in simultaneously and therefore they cancel each other out. And in that reading, we maintain the words of the Mishnah, which says that when it's one against one, the drinking continues because they cancel each other out. Or a different version of the Mishnah, which is no, one witness came forward, he's been established as believed. And if when the second one comes and contradicts, irrelevant, because the first one's been established as a two, and therefore the Sotah law is called off. Different reading of the same Mishnah. Changing a word.
Unless the second one comes in with valid proof.
So again, we're assuming at the moment that all we have is one word against the other. Okay, so now we have to go through the Mishnah and see if we can substantiate everybody's variation based on all the 4 cases in the Mishnah. That's the exercise the Gemara is going to do right now, which is about a third from the bottom of the page where it reads Tanan. Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah where it says, Eid Omer, in the second set of 2 cases in which you have 1 against 2. 1 against 2 in both directions. 1 saying intimacy, 2 saying no, 2 saying intimacy, 1 saying no. So let's look at one at a time. Tonight we learned, Eid Omer Nitmis, 1 witness comes along and says she was intimate. Shnaim Omer, 2 say, Loy Nitmis, she was not intimate. So the law here is, Hoysa Shoysa, she would go ahead and drink because the 2 say there was no intimacy, and that overpowers the one who said there is intimacy. Now, if we look just at this phrase, what would I conclude? That only if there are two to overpower the one, then we cancel the first guy's testimony. But hachad v'chad, if it was one against one, loy hosa shoisa, she wouldn't drink. And this is to Yufta de Rabchia. This contradicts Rabchia's position. Because Rabchia's position, who described our Mishnah as people coming together at the same time, and therefore they should cancel each other out. Right? One second. Rabchia's view is that they cancel the one against one when they come at the same time, they cancel each other out, and therefore she does drink the Sotah water. Whereas the implication from this last phrasing in the Mishnah is that only when it's two against one do we cancel. But for one against one, we don't cancel. That's what it seems from this phrasing. Because in this phrasing, it's only two against one that cancels the original one. Whereas Rabchia said that if one against one come at the same time, they cancel each other out. Exactly, she shouldn't. Well, if you cancel each other out, then we're back to square one, in which we don't know what happened behind closed doors. Right? So Rabchia said one against one cancel each other out. But this phrasing of the Mishnah seems to say that only two against one can cancel each other out. Yeah. So Amar Rabchia then can respond and say, well, l'tamech, according to you, Ula, which you say that one against one is coming one after the other, and therefore once the one is established, he's accepted as two, and therefore the second guy can't cancel him, and therefore the Sotah law is called off because we have two witnesses, i.e. the one witness who tells us that there's intimacy. According to you, would Rabbi Chia respond? Ema Seifa. Look at the very next clause. The next clause is Shnaim Omer Nitmis, two say there was intimacy. Echad Omer Lo Nitmis, one says there's no intimacy. Well, what's the law there? Lo Yosa Shoisa, she wouldn't drink. Because the original two said yes, intimacy, and they are stronger than the one who said no intimacy. And therefore, because there's intimacy based on two witnesses, no reason to drink. Now that implies that only when you have two telling you there is intimacy, then it can override the one who says there's no intimacy. Hachad v'chad. But if there's one against one saying yes intimacy, one saying no intimacy, they would cancel each other out. Whereas according to you, Ula, because they don't come one after the other, the first guy is established, and therefore we do believe him, therefore the Sotah doesn't go on. So the two phrasings in the second clause, in other words, the second set of two, which describe two against one, right? Each one implies a different law about one against one. The clause which says that two saying intimacy overrides the one of no intimacy seems to imply one against one doesn't override each other. In fact, they don't override each other. That would be a question to Rabbi Chia, who said when they come together, they do override each other. Whereas the other clause, which says two no intimacy, one yes intimacy, the two that say no intimacy overrides, then that would mean one against one does not override. Whereas you, Ula, said you, Chia, said they do override. The other way around, right? Let's do it again. If two say yes intimacy, one says no intimacy. In that case, Sotah law is called off because two said yes intimacy, right? That implies that one against one, the Sotah law is not called off because only when you have two against one is it called off. That would be a contradiction to Ula, who said one against one is not called off because the one has believability. Now the other clause, which says two no intimacy, yes one intimacy, in which case the Sotah law is not called off because the two overpower, would imply that one against one is yes called off, and that's contradiction of Chia, which said that it's not called off because they cancel each other out. Yeah. So how do we deal with this? So explains the Gemara like this, and we'll read a few lines and then we'll stop over there because the Gemara is going to give us another variation tomorrow. Okay. Ella rather, Kula, we must conclude, therefore, that the entirety of the Mishnah is Bipsule Edus, is all with invalid witnesses. Well, the first two clauses are clear, it's invalid witnesses, because the first two clauses is one against one. Those aren't normal valid witnesses. And the second one is woman against woman, which is also not usually a valid witness. Now, what the Gemara is adding here is that, first of all, the one against one described earlier could even be a slave, which isn't ordinarily, which even if you were to pair up with someone else, isn't ordinarily a valid witness. Moreover, the second clause, which talks about two against one in either direction, is also talking about where the witnesses are not valid. So there are slaves, it's women, they're not ordinarily valid witnesses. Now, what happens when you have invalid witnesses? Then, we treat it in accordance with the view of Rabbi Nechemia. The Tanya, for we've learned, Rabbi Nechemia says, whenever Torah gives the believability to one person, which means, therefore, so the principle we had yesterday was that if Torah gives the validity to one witness to be a valid witness, we treat him as if it's two, giving him the full believability of two witnesses. Rabbi Nechemia says no. If Torah believes one witness, that means Torah is taking this case out of the ordinary necessity of believing of witnesses to establish an event. It's exactly the reverse of what we said. Yesterday we were saying that if Torah believes one witness, take that one witness and elevate him to the level of witness that's required for any event. And when Nechemia says, no. If Torah says that this case doesn't need two witnesses, then take that case out of the necessity of norming witnesses and lower its standard. You're taking it out of the ordinary way of witness, then halach acharei deis, go by the majority view. Ordinarily, in the realm of witnesses, two, we said yesterday, it's like 100. 100 people say one thing happened, two people say another thing happened. They get equal validity because Torah says two is believed. So they have 2 or 100, equal belief. And therefore, we said yesterday, if Torah gives believability to one, elevate him to the status of 2, making him equal to 100. Whereas Nechemia says no. If Torah singles out a specific case and says, here we'll believe one witness, that means Torah is saying this set of laws does not follow the ordinary standard of how testimony is established. Now, if you're taking it out of the ordinary system of how testimony is established, then 2 against 100 follow the 100, because we've undermined the whole structure of testimony. So it's the exact opposite of yesterday. And that's why whenever there's a majority, go with the majority. Even though we might be giving the one believability, because the whole thing is out. The whole believability of one and giving him the full testimony is gone. We're dropping the whole testimony system because Torah says believe one, which means Torah is saying don't use the ordinary testimony system. So go after the majority, and that's it. Now, if that's the case, we're turning 2 women, bi'ish echad, against one man, kishnei anashim bi'ish echad, like 2 men against one man. So even if you have 2 women against one man, the woman is believed more. If you were going by the ordinary standards of testimony, and we took the one person and turned him into 2, then 1 man against 2 women, the 1 man would be believed because he's given the status of testimony. But once we're dropping the whole status of testimony and you're going by the majority opinion, then even if you have 1 guy against 2 women, follow the 2 women. And that's the second clause is at the end there.
Majority evidence.
Majority opinion of people coming to testify as to what happens, even if 2 of them happen to be women. And that's what the Mishnah is referring to. When it says 2 against 1, it's not 2 males against 1. It's 2 women against 1 male, or 2 women against 1 woman. In which case, go by the majority, because Torah says, drop the ordinary testimony standard. So it's exactly the reverse of how we understood it yesterday. Okay. So if this wasn't confusing enough, God willing, tomorrow the Gemara is going to introduce a 3rd way of looking at the Mishnah. So you have 2 ways of looking at the Mishnah so far. One is take this single guy, turn him into 2, giving him believability of 2, and structure your whole Mishnah around that, leaving with some questions about how we understand the 2 against 1. Fine. Or read it, which by the way, that's the halacha. The halacha is we turn the 1 guy into 2. Or as we're learning today, no, if Torah says we believe 1, then drop the whole standard of testimony and just go by the majority of testimony. Women, men, slaves, whatever it is. All right. And then that's how we'll understand the Mishnah when it discusses 1 against 2 or 2 against 1. Okay, wonderful day, Yidden. Tomorrow, God willing, we're going to introduce a new way of reading the Mishnah.
I would have preferred to believe the guy who says, no, it didn't happen,
Yeah.
because you never know. The one who says it did happen, was it grudge he's got against her and he's lying?
Right. So,
If he says no, he's got proof.
right. So the way we understood it till now is that the reason why we're giving believability to the guy who says there was intimacy is because there's already an established backstory. We have 2 witnesses. We have established that there's warning. We have established there's trouble in the marriage. We have established that this woman is suspected with this guy. And we have established 2 witnesses that say that they were secluded. So because there's so much like corroborating evidence to the surroundings of their intimacy, so one guy coming and saying it was intimate, it's almost like just the icing on the cake, because we already suspected this was going on anyway. That's why we're giving believability to that guy.
You know, trouble in the marriage could be the guy who's setting her up. Her husband is setting her up.
Yeah, then we would need some serious evidence.
Because he was monitoring.
Maybe we need some serious evidence to that effect.
I wouldn't have to be the best in for that.
Nope.
Happily, you're on page 1 of the Google reviews. 1 witness as good as 2.
Nice. Okay, wonderful day. Tomorrow, another way of understanding the Mishnah.